The rain had been falling since dawn, a steady rhythm against the courthouse windows that seemed to echo the dull ache inside Daniel Carter's chest. Seattle was gray that morning, the kind of gray that swallowed light, swallowed sound, swallowed hope. He sat at the long oak table, fingers interlocked, watching the slow drip of water slide down the glass. Across from him, Emily adjusted the sleeve of her ivory blouse and offered a faint, practiced smile. The same smile she used when pretending everything was fine. The judge hadn't entered yet. The room smelled faintly of paper and coffee, the air dense with a silence that wasn't peace but exhaustion. Scott Hayes, Emily's lawyer and lover, whispered something to her. She chuckled softly, a sound that used to mean warmth to Daniel, but now only reminded him of distance. He studied her face. She looked perfect, as always, hair pinned up neatly, makeup precise, posture straight, as if she were posing for a photograph. She had always been meticulous about appearances. That, he thought, was one of the reasons they fell apart. He'd been too busy chasing meaning while she was chasing perfection. When the judge entered, everyone rose. Papers shuffled, chairs creaked. The bailiff spoke in formal monotone. Emily kept her gaze forward, calm, detached. Daniel felt the faint pulse of his heart in his temples. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his head, but reality still stung. "Miss Carter," the judge said, sliding the divorce decree across the table. "Please review and sign." Emily took the pen without hesitation. Her hand was steady, her expression almost serene. She didn't even glance at Daniel. He caught a glimpse of her smile, subtle, triumphant, the kind of smile that said, "I've moved on." She signed her name in looping, elegant letters. As the pen touched the paper, Daniel exhaled quietly. The sound was lost beneath the hum of fluorescent lights. He thought about the day they first met, how she'd laughed at his jokes, how she'd believed in his dreams when no one else did. That laughter was gone now, replaced by calculation. He wondered when love had turned into something transactional. Emily slid the papers back to the judge, her smile never faltering. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm, almost cheerful. "It's been a long process." Daniel didn't respond. He looked down at the ring still on his finger, then at the empty space where hers used to be. There were words he could have said, apologies, accusations, maybe even forgiveness, but they all felt meaningless now. Silence felt more honest. The judge glanced between them, expression unreadable. "Mr. Carter, your signature, please." He took the pen. His hands were steady, but his chest felt hollow. He signed slowly, each stroke of ink like carving his name into the past. When he was done, he set the pen down gently and met Emily's eyes for the first time that morning. There was no anger there, no love either. Just a quiet recognition, two people who once shared everything, now reduced to paperwork. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere over Puget Sound. The sound vibrated through the glass, low and distant. Emily gathered her purse, straightened her blouse, and stood. "Well," she said, almost lightly. "I guess that's that." Daniel nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "That's that." For a brief moment, he thought she might hesitate, that maybe she'd look back, that some remnant of the woman he once knew would flicker through. But she didn't. She turned to leave, her heels clicking on the polished floor, each step crisp and final. He watched her go until the door closed behind her. Then he sat there for a long time, the rain outside now a steady roar. The clerk entered to collect the documents, murmuring something about final copies and mailing addresses. Daniel nodded absently. When the room was empty again, he let his shoulders drop. A breath escaped him, half relief, half grief. He had thought he'd feel free, but what settled instead was quiet desolation. Years of love reduced to signatures. Outside, through the blurred window, he saw Emily walking toward the parking lot. Umbrella open, head held high. Scott followed her, holding the door of a silver Lexus. They looked like a perfect couple, silhouettes framed against the rain. Daniel stood and approached the window. For the first time that morning, he smiled not out of bitterness, but finality. Love, he realized, doesn't die in storms. It dies in silence. And that silence had begun long before today. He turned away, picked up his coat, and stepped into the rain. The city swallowed him whole. The apartment was quiet when Daniel returned. Too quiet for a place that once held laughter. He dropped his keys on the counter, and the small metallic sound echoed across the empty room. The rain had followed him home, whispering against the windows like an old song he no longer wanted to hear. The space still carried traces of her. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the hallway. Floral. Expensive. Unmistakably. Emily. On the back of the chair by the window hung her silk scarf, left behind months ago but untouched since. He couldn't bring himself to move it. Some part of him believed that as long as it stayed there, she might return. He made coffee the way he always did, black, strong, 2 sugars. The routine felt mechanical, stripped of purpose. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam curling upward, and thought about the mornings they once shared. Emily used to hum while she cooked, barefoot on the cold tiles, hair a mess, but eyes full of mischief. She would pour his coffee first, take a sip from his cup just to tease him, and laugh when he pretended to scold her. That laugh had been everything. He closed his eyes and saw it again, their first meeting at a tech conference in San Francisco. She was an intern in marketing then. Bright, ambitious, carrying a notepad full of dreams. He was a startup founder with nothing but a prototype and too much hope. They had spent hours talking about ideas, about building something meaningful, something that lasted. Emily had believed in him before anyone else did, and for a while, that belief was enough. When they married, they rented a small apartment overlooking Lake Union. Money was tight, but happiness came cheap back then. Late-night walks, shared noodles, plans scribbled on napkins. Daniel worked long hours, but Emily didn't mind. She said she loved watching him chase his dreams. But dreams, he learned, have a cost. The first investor pulled out, then the second. Months turned into years of financial strain. He remembered the night she stopped waiting for him to come home for dinner. The night the laughter in their house turned to silence. She started staying late at work, attending networking events that didn't make sense. When he asked, she smiled and said he was paranoid. He wanted to believe her. God. He did. He thought working harder would fix it, that success could glue the cracks together. But every promotion, every deal, every small victory only widened the gap. Emily wanted a man who made her feel seen, not a man buried in code and contracts. He took a sip of the bitter coffee. It had gone cold. The scarf by the chair seemed to watch him, a reminder of what he couldn't fix. He stood, picked it up, and held it for a moment. The fabric was soft, smooth between his fingers. It still smelled like her skin. For a heartbeat, he almost pressed it to his face. Instead, he folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. Enough, he thought. He walked through each room slowly, the bedroom with its half-empty closet, the study lined with folders from his old company, the balcony where Emily used to water plants and talk about the future. Everything was frozen in time, untouched since she left. On the desk lay a framed photo from their first anniversary, the two of them smiling in front of the Space Needle, wind in their hair, eyes full of hope. He picked it up, studied it under the lamplight, and realized how young they looked, how certain that love could outlast disappointment. He placed the photo face down. Outside, the rain thickened, drumming harder against the glass. Daniel leaned against the window, watching the city lights blur through the downpour. Somewhere out there, Emily was probably in a restaurant, laughing with Scott, pretending this was all for the best. He wasn't angry anymore, just tired. He whispered into the empty room, not expecting an answer. When did we stop fighting for each other? The silence that followed was deep, almost sacred. He walked to his computer, powered it on, and stared at the code on the screen, the half-finished framework of what would later become Elysium. It was the only thing that made sense now. Work didn't lie, it didn't cheat, it didn't laugh while breaking your heart. He sat down, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The city outside shimmered in rain and neon, and for the first time that day, Daniel felt something stir, a small, quiet resolve. Maybe love had ended, but something else could begin. He started to type. Daniel had always believed betrayal would come with noise, shouting, slammed doors, and the kind of chaos that leaves everything shattered. But when it arrived, it was silent. A flicker on his office computer screen, a folder mislabeled, and a video file that should never have existed. Emily, Scott Hayes, his wife, his company's attorney, they were laughing. Too close, too familiar. It wasn't just a fleeting affair. It was routine, practiced, comfortable. Daniel watched the muted footage in disbelief, his breath caught between his ribs. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. His pulse roared in his ears. But outside, the city kept moving. Indifferent. He didn't rage. He didn't throw the monitor or call her name. He simply sat back, staring at the screen until his reflection blurred into theirs. The realization hit him slowly, like a dull blade pressing against skin pain without blood, humiliation without sound. That evening, when Emily came home, she was radiant. She carried the same perfume she had worn the day they first met. Jasmine and quiet deceit. "Long day?" she asked, placing her purse on the counter. "Long enough," Daniel replied. He smiled. It was a tired, broken thing. She leaned in to kiss his cheek, unaware that the world between them had already collapsed. Daniel watched her carefully, memorizing the curve of her lips, the softness of her voice, the ease with which she lied. That night, while Emily slept beside him, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His heart didn't ache with love anymore. It ached with the weight of clarity. The woman he built his world around was no longer his anchor. She was the knife that had been cutting the ropes for years. By morning, something inside him had shifted. He moved through the house quietly, his movements deliberate. He poured himself a cup of black coffee and sat by the window as dawn broke. Outside, the city glowed cold, metallic, merciless. It was fitting. At the office, Daniel didn't confront Scott. Not yet. Instead, he began observing. Small things. Who spoke to whom? Who hesitated when he entered the room? Who avoided his gaze? The company had always been his pride, but now it felt like a living organism infected from within. He could almost hear the rot beneath the polished surface. He started taking notes, financial inconsistencies, side deals, unapproved transfers. The deeper he looked, the clearer it became. Emily and Scott weren't just lovers. They were partners in betrayal, in deceit, and perhaps even in theft. But Daniel was done being the trusting man. He called his accountant, an old friend named Marcus, and asked him to quietly audit every transaction from the past 2 years. "Don't tell anyone," Daniel said, his tone low and firm. "Not even me until you're done. Not even me until you're done." At night, Emily would ask why he seemed distracted. He'd smile and tell her he was working on a new project. In a way, he was rebuilding himself. Weeks passed. The truth unfolded like a slow, cruel symphony. The company had been bleeding money. Scott's legal firm had been funneling funds under fake consulting agreements, with Emily's approval. Daniel didn't confront her. He waited. He wanted to see how far she'd go when she believed he was still blind. But something unexpected happened in the silence. Daniel began to change. He no longer felt like a victim. He was calculating, sharper than he'd ever been. Pain had burned away the softness in him, leaving only steel. He worked late, restructured divisions, and replaced key executives under the pretext of reorganization. No one questioned him. His calmness frightened them more than anger ever could. One night, as Emily chatted on the phone, her tone light, almost giddy, Daniel stood in the doorway of his study and watched her. She didn't notice. Her laughter cut through him. Yet strangely, he no longer felt pain, only distance. He realized something profound. Betrayal doesn't destroy you. It redefines you. When she hung up, she found him standing there, his expression unreadable. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. "Perfect," he said, and for the first time, he meant it not because life was perfect, but because he was finally ready to start again. As she walked away, Daniel turned toward the window. The city shimmered with a cruel, beautiful light. He whispered to himself, "Let her think she's won." In the reflection of the glass, he saw not a broken man, but one reborn in silence, sharper, colder, untouchable. He would rebuild everything, but this time, without her. Daniel disappeared from the world without warning. No dramatic farewell posts, no explanations. One morning, his social media accounts were gone, his phone unreachable, and his name stopped appearing in company emails. It was as if he had simply evaporated. In truth, he had retreated into a small apartment on the edge of the city, a place where no one knew his past, his marriage, or the quiet disaster that had gutted his life. The curtains stayed drawn most days. His desk was crowded with notebooks, screens, and coffee cups. The walls bore reminders of his solitude, equations scrawled in black marker, half-eaten meals, and sketches of a single word circled again and again: Elysium. He built the project out of necessity, not ambition. After the betrayal, Daniel needed something to anchor him, something that made sense in a world that had stopped making any. Elysium began as a whisper in his mind. An idea for an artificial intelligence system, capable of emotional interpretation technology, that could read, respond, and even adapt to human feeling. A paradox, perhaps. Teaching machines to understand empathy when humans around him had forgotten it. He coded relentlessly. Days bled into nights, and nights into silence. He no longer counted time by hours but by breakthroughs, by each problem solved, each bug fixed. His friends tried reaching out at first, sending concerned messages. Then silence followed when he didn't respond. Daniel preferred it that way. Pity was noise. And he had no use for noise. The man who once ran a company now lived off black coffee, instant noodles, and the quiet rhythm of his own keystrokes. Yet in that isolation, something extraordinary happened. His mind sharpened. He became ruthless with his thoughts, disciplined with his pain. Every ounce of hurt, every drop of humiliation turned into fuel for creation. When Elysium finally began to function, Daniel almost didn't believe it. The interface pulsed like a heartbeat, responding to tone, context, and even the subtext of emotion. It was raw, imperfect, but alive in its own strange way. He smiled for the first time in months, not because he felt joy, but because he felt control. One evening, as rain whispered against the window, Daniel recorded a short video demo and sent it to an old investor who owed him a favor. He didn't explain much, just a few lines of code, a glimpse of what Elysium could do. The response came within hours. An invitation to present the project privately. The following months unfolded like a silent revolution. Word spread within tight circles of the tech world. Venture capital firms whispered about a mysterious AI startup with no known founder. Daniel kept his name out of every document. The company was registered under a shell identity. Even his closest contacts didn't realize that Elysium was his. He watched from the shadows as Elysium exploded into the global market: healthcare, education, security, even therapy applications. The world was in awe of what the unknown creator had built. Meanwhile, Emily was too busy parading around with Scott to notice that the man she betrayed had just changed the world. Irony, Daniel thought, was the universe's quiet poetry. At night, when he finally allowed himself to rest, he'd sit by the window and stare at the city lights. There was no triumph in his expression, only serenity. He didn't crave fame or vengeance, not yet. That would come in time. For now, he cherished his anonymity. He received dozens of offers, buyouts, partnerships, acquisitions, all declined. The company continued to grow under his silent command. Every success pushed him further from the man he once was. The timid husband, the trusting partner gone. What remained was a version of Daniel that few could have imagined. Cold, focused, untouchable. The divorce papers arrived one afternoon. Emily's lawyer, Scott, of course, had attached a brief note suggesting amicable settlement. Daniel almost laughed. He signed without hesitation, his pen gliding across the line like a final incision. He didn't attend the proceedings. He didn't need to. The judge's stamp would end a chapter that had already died long ago. What mattered was what came next. A year had passed since his disappearance. The world now spoke the name Elysium with reverence. Governments sought partnerships. Universities taught its framework. And yet, the true creator remained a ghost. Daniel stood before his mirror one night, clean-shaven, his eyes no longer haunted but sharp. He barely recognized himself, and that was the point, he whispered. They buried me. But they forgot I was the one holding the shovel. And with that, he opened his laptop, typed the final line of code for Elysium 2, and smiled. The next phase of his silent empire was ready, and this time, the world would see him rise, not as a victim of betrayal, but as the architect of rebirth. The courthouse was colder than Emily remembered. The marble floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, echoing every heel strike as she walked toward the courtroom with Scott by her side. She wore confidence like perfume, subtle but deliberate. A cream designer dress, gold earrings, the practiced smile of a woman certain of victory. Scott leaned close as they reached the doors. "Don't worry, Emily. He'll probably settle. He doesn't have much left anyway." Emily nodded, lips curving. "He's not the type to fight anymore. That's the one thing I always liked about Daniel, he knew when to give up." Inside, Daniel was already seated at the far end of the long oak table. He wore a simple navy suit, no tie, hair neatly combed. He didn't look broken, but he didn't look triumphant either, just still, composed in a way that unnerved her. She almost didn't recognize him. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes, called the session to order. Paperwork shuffled, voices murmured. She just wanted this over with the final signature, the freedom, the beginning of her new life with Scott. The proceedings began routinely. Scott presented his statement. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Emily Carter, is requesting fair distribution of remaining marital assets. As agreed." Daniel's attorney, a quiet woman in a gray suit, stood. "Correction, Your Honor. As of the updated financial report submitted last week, the total valuation of Mr. Carter's holdings has changed." Emily frowned slightly. "Updated?" she whispered to Scott. Scott's brow furrowed. "Probably a few stocks or patents he still has. Nothing major." The judge adjusted his glasses, flipping through the file. "Mr. Carter, according to these documents, your declared assets now total approximately..." He paused, blinking twice as if verifying what he had just read. $2.4 billion? The words fell like a gunshot. For a long moment, the room didn't breathe. The clerk stopped typing. Even the security guard near the door looked up. Emily's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. What did you just say?" she stammered. The judge repeated, slower this time. $2.4 billion, Mrs. Carter. That includes intellectual property and controlling shares of the AI corporation Elysium Technologies. Her gaze snapped toward Daniel. He didn't move, didn't flinch. His hands rested calmly on the table, one thumb tracing the edge of a silver pen. Scott's face drained of color. "Elysium?" he whispered. "He's Elysium?" Daniel finally looked up. His eyes met Scott's, not with anger, not even satisfaction, but something colder. "Surprised?" he said softly. "I thought you of all people would recognize innovation when you saw it." The judge cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Given this revelation, the settlement terms must be revised. Mrs. Carter, it appears your husband is not the bankrupt man your counsel assumed." Emily tried to speak, but her voice trembled. "That can't be right. He had nothing. He left with nothing." Daniel's attorney handed over another folder. "All verified, Your Honor. Mr. Carter built Elysium independently during their separation. All intellectual property was registered under his name alone." Emily's vision blurred. The courtroom walls seemed to tilt. Just last week, she'd mocked him to her friends, the washed-up engineer, still clinging to failed dreams. Now, every mocking word turned into a blade cutting through her own pride. Scott reached for her hand under the table, but she pulled away. His touch felt poisonous now, the touch of a man who had promised her a future that no longer existed. The judge continued with professional detachment. "Given the prenuptial agreement and the independent nature of Mr. Carter's business, Mrs. Carter is entitled only to previously agreed personal assets and no share of Elysium Technologies." The sound of the gavel striking was final. Daniel stood, buttoned his jacket, and turned toward the judge. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said quietly. Then he looked at Emily. "I wish you peace, Emily." Truly, there was no venom in his tone, no gloating. Just the calm certainty of a man who had already buried the pain. Emily's mouth opened, but no words came. The room seemed smaller now, suffocating. Scott avoided her eyes completely. As Daniel walked past them, he paused briefly, leaning slightly toward Scott. "Next time you gamble your career for love," he murmured, "make sure it's love worth losing everything for." Then he walked out, the click of his shoes echoing against the marble floors, steady, unhurried, and absolute. Outside the courthouse, reporters were beginning to gather. News had already spread about the mysterious billionaire behind Elysium. Cameras flashed, questions flew, but Daniel didn't stop. He slipped on his sunglasses, nodded once to his driver, and got into the waiting car. As the vehicle pulled away, he looked at the courthouse shrinking in the rearview mirror. Inside those walls, his past had finally died. He whispered, almost to himself, "Now, let's see what silence can build next." And for the first time in years, Daniel Carter allowed himself a real smile, quiet, measured, victorious. The hallway outside the courtroom was eerily quiet after the verdict. The noise of reporters and lawyers had faded into the distance, leaving behind only the soft echo of footsteps and the hollow hum of the air vents. Emily stood by the marble wall, one hand clutching her purse like it might steady her trembling. Her eyes followed Daniel as he signed the final documents with the court clerk. He didn't rush, didn't fidget. Every motion was deliberate, calm, almost graceful. When he finally turned toward her, she opened her mouth, desperate to speak before he could leave again. "Daniel, wait, please." He stopped. His expression didn't change. The same quiet calm that had unnerved her in the courtroom remained unreadable, almost serene. Emily's voice cracked. "You have to understand, I never meant for it to go this far. I thought you didn't care anymore." Daniel's gaze was steady. "And so you made sure I wouldn't." The words weren't cruel. They weren't even loud. But they landed with the weight of 1,000 unspoken nights. She shook her head quickly, tears blurring her mascara. "No, you don't get it. I was scared. You shut me out. You were always working. Always somewhere else." Scott was convenient, Daniel finished for her. She froze. He took a small step closer, but his tone remained soft, almost detached. "You wanted noise, Emily. Excitement. Validation. I was quiet. I thought love didn't need to shout to be real." Her lips trembled. "And now? What is this revenge?" Daniel's eyes met hers fully then, and for the briefest moment, she saw a flicker, not anger, but something far more painful. "No," he said. "If I wanted revenge, I'd still care." The silence that followed was unbearable. She wanted him to scream, to break, to show something. Anything that would prove she still had a hold on him, but the calm in his eyes told her the truth. She was no longer a wound, just a memory. Her breath hitched. "Do you ever miss us?" He smiled faintly, a weary curve of his lips. "Every version of us ended long before today. I think I just kept loving the ghost." She felt her knees weaken. "You're different now," she whispered. Daniel looked past her, toward the glass doors that led outside where the sun was already breaking through the clouds. "I had to be." For a moment, neither moved. The world outside seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them, two people who had once shared everything and now couldn't even share silence without drowning in it. Emily took a hesitant step forward. "Daniel, I'm sorry. I really am. I made mistakes." He interrupted her gently. "You didn't make mistakes, Emily. You made choices. And now you're just seeing where they led." Her tears fell freely now. "You make it sound so simple." "It is," he said quietly. "Pain complicates it. Pride sustains it. But the truth is always simple." He turned to leave, and something inside her broke. "Daniel, please." She called after him, voice trembling. "Can't we?" He paused but didn't turn around. "No, Emily. You wanted an ending. This is it." And then he walked away. Emily stood frozen in the hallway, surrounded by the ghosts of her own making. The world she had built, the glamorous facade, the affair, the plans for freedom, all of it collapsed in a single exhale. Through the glass, she watched Daniel step into the daylight. The reporters swarmed him, microphones flashing, cameras blinding. But he remained composed, untouchable. For a brief, unbearable second, he glanced back. Their eyes met one last time through the glass barrier. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. Just a look, steady, final, and devastatingly calm. It was that look, not the fortune, not the fame that shattered her. Because in that silence, she finally understood. The opposite of love wasn't hate. It was indifference. The world kept moving around her, voices rising again, footsteps echoing down the hall. Emily stayed still, feeling her breath catch in her throat, her hand pressed weakly against the cool glass where his reflection had been moments earlier. "You used to love me," she whispered, as if the air could carry the words to him. But Daniel was already gone. Only his silence remained heavy, echoing, absolute. And in that silence, Emily realized it wasn't money she had lost, nor status. It was the one man who had once seen every flaw she had and loved her anyway. And now, he didn't see her at all. Emily moved into a small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city. It was the kind of place where the walls were too thin, where she could hear the neighbor's television late into the night, and where the air smelled faintly of paint and loneliness. The curtains were secondhand, the furniture minimal, but the silence was deafening. She used to wake up to the sound of Daniel brewing coffee in their old kitchen. Now, the only sound that greeted her was the ticking of the clock, slow, hollow, indifferent. She told herself it was temporary, that she just needed time to start over. But the truth was, she didn't know where to begin. Her name had become a whisper among those who once admired her. The colleagues who used to laugh with her avoided eye contact now. Her friends, who once envied her marriage, stopped calling after the divorce went public. All she had left was a phone full of old photos and a man she could no longer reach. Daniel's name was everywhere. News outlets called him the visionary comeback of the decade. Magazines praised his resilience, his genius, his grace under betrayal. His company, rebuilt from ashes, now stood at the forefront of artificial intelligence innovation. Every time Emily saw his face on a screen, that calm, steady look, that quiet strength, something inside her twisted. He didn't look like the man she remembered. The Daniel she once knew was gentle, a little unsure of himself, always trying to please her. The Daniel she saw now was different, colder, sharper, untouchable. He no longer looked like someone who could be broken. Sometimes, she stayed up until dawn scrolling through interviews and articles about him. She would pause the videos just to look at his eyes. There was no anger there, no bitterness, just an absence so vast it frightened her. She tried to imagine what he felt when he discovered her betrayal, when he sat in that courtroom watching her and Scott side by side. But every time she reached that thought, she broke down. Her phone became both her refuge and her torment. Every few days, she drafted a message. "I'm sorry. Can we talk? I didn't mean to lose you." Then she'd stare at the blinking cursor, her thumb hovering over the send button, before deleting everything. What could she possibly say to undo what she'd done? What words could bridge the chasm between them? One evening, she watched a live broadcast of Daniel's latest presentation. He was on stage at a global tech summit, presenting Elysium's newest breakthrough, a system capable of replicating human empathy through AI. The crowd erupted in applause. Daniel smiled faintly, the same smile she used to wake up beside. But when he looked out into the audience, his gaze seemed to travel far beyond the lights, beyond the cameras. Emily felt a tear roll down her cheek. For a second, she foolishly imagined he might be thinking of her. When the applause faded and the screen went dark, she sat there for a long time, her phone in her lap. She opened the message thread again. There was still nothing from him. The last message was from years ago. "Dinner's ready, love." It felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Weeks passed. Seasons changed. Daniel continued to rise. She continued to fade. She heard through mutual acquaintances that he had bought a house by the ocean, that he rarely appeared at social gatherings, that he spent most of his nights working or walking alone along the shore. He seemed at peace, and that peace was what hurt her most. One night, she stood on her balcony, looking down at the city lights, flickering like distant memories. The wind was cold, and she wrapped her arms around herself. She whispered into the night, as if he could somehow hear her, "You deserved better than what I gave you." There was no answer, only the hum of traffic far below. Emily closed her eyes. The silence between them was not empty, it was full of words unsaid, apologies never spoken, love that had curdled into regret. She finally understood what true loss felt like. It wasn't about money, comfort, or reputation. It was about standing in the ruins of your own choices. Watching the one person who once believed in you walk away and realizing they'll never look back. And so, Emily stayed in that quiet apartment, living among the echoes of a past she could never reclaim. As the world moved on without her, it had been a year since the courtroom. A year since Daniel last saw Emily's face. Seattle was wrapped in its usual gray drizzle that morning, the kind that made the city feel like it was perpetually caught between memory and renewal. Daniel stood by the wide glass window of his penthouse office, watching raindrops trace crooked paths down the glass. The world outside was blurred. Soft, forgiving, he had rebuilt everything, his company, his life, himself. Elysium had grown beyond his wildest imagination, expanding into fields he once only dreamed of. His name was now spoken in conferences, quoted in books, admired by people who would never know the pain behind the journey. Yet, success had lost its sharpness. It no longer thrilled him. It simply existed, like the steady hum of rain against the window pane. That morning, his assistant knocked lightly on the door, holding an envelope. "It's handwritten," she said, a little surprised. "No return address." Daniel took it, recognizing the delicate curve of the handwriting even before he saw her name. Emily Carter. For a moment, his pulse faltered. He hadn't seen those letters, her handwriting, in years. The envelope was slightly smudged, as if it had traveled far, touched by too many hands. Or maybe by tears. He stood still for a while before finally sitting down, sliding a finger beneath the seal. The letter was 3 pages long, written on ivory paper. Her words began simply, "Daniel, I don't know if you'll read this. Maybe you shouldn't. But I needed to say what I never had the courage to say, not in court. Not before. Not after. I'm sorry. For everything." She spoke of the loneliness that followed, of how success had once blinded her, how she mistook comfort for love, admiration for happiness. She described the silence of her small apartment, how the nights were the hardest, how she would still catch herself reaching for a voice that no longer existed in her world. "You were kind, even when I didn't deserve it. You were strong, even when I broke you. And I see now that strength isn't about winning. It's about walking through pain and still choosing to be gentle." Daniel read slowly. There were no excuses in her words. No manipulation. Only a fragile honesty. The kind that comes when a person has already lost everything worth pretending for. "I don't ask for forgiveness," she wrote near the end. "I only wanted you to know that I finally understand what you meant when you said love was a choice, not a feeling. You chose me once. I didn't choose you back. And that will always be my regret." By the time he reached the last line, Daniel realized his hands were trembling slightly. He folded the letter carefully, as if it were made of something fragile, and placed it back into the envelope. Then he walked to the window again. Seattle's skyline shimmered through the mist, soft and melancholic. The rain was falling harder now, but it felt cleansing rather than cold. He stood there for a long time, watching the city breathe beneath the downpour. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't about erasing the past. It wasn't even about the other person. It was about reclaiming his peace, the part of himself that had been trapped between anger and grief for far too long. He whispered softly, though no one could hear, "I forgive you." The words hung in the air, quiet, weightless. For the first time in years, he felt his chest loosen. He didn't plan to reply. There was nothing left to say. Some stories end not with closure, but with acceptance, two souls standing on opposite sides of the same rain, both finally understanding what love had cost them. As he turned off the office lights, Daniel lingered by the window. Outside, people rushed with umbrellas, cars splashed through puddles, life moved forward. He reached out, touched the cool glass, and smiled a faint, almost invisible smile, but real. The world no longer owed him answers. He no longer owed anyone pain. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the sound of rain and distant thunder, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. And as the city blurred behind the falling rain, he closed his eyes and breathed in the scent of wet earth and second chances. Somewhere between the past and the present, redemption had quietly found him.